So, like I said, this is Introduction of Tab. So he is from Stellenbosch, Tycho campus. He's here funded by the MRC to improve the bioinformatics landscape of the country. So please take the opportunity to learn about this really important field, and thank Prof. Tab for giving the time. It's difficult enough to get our own lecturers to lecture, but also to have someone to volunteer to talk or teach is a really great thing. We also thank him for his involvement in our schools.
Thank you. Well, hi everybody. It's great to see so many faces. I teach as part of this honors program and as part of the honors program in molecular biology and human genetics. A lot of people don't even realize that the medical school attached to Tygerberg Hospital has a graduate program. So I came here as part of that, and I'm glad to get to work as part of biotechnology as well. I will be recording each of these lectures, and I'll probably try to record the tutorials as well. So this is a two-part week. We're going to have a 9 o'clock lecture each morning, and we're going to have an 11:30 tutorial in the programming language R. You probably have not thought a whole lot about why you need to be a programmer. But in fact, we find that a lot of people escape into biology thinking that that's how they can evade math. But the reality is that modern molecular biology, modern genetics, is heavily informatically driven. So my goal is to arm you, to give you some weaponry and some shields to use against people who are going to try to snow bad ideas past you. And I hope that in the course of this week, you're going to get a lot of information that you might otherwise have missed. So I don't think this is all going to be completely redundant with things you've heard before. I wanted to point out the schedule is a little unusual. We have bioinformatics distributed throughout the year. So for this week, for the 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, and the 1st, we're going to be talking through these topics. Today is different terms from computer science that have made their way into bioinformatics. Tomorrow will be imaging and flow cytometry. Wednesday is relational databases and repositories. Thursday is protein structure and function. And finally, pathways and networks. It's a topic that never gets discussed enough, I think, so I'm glad we're going to have some space for it. So this is somewhat disconnected from the tutorial in R, which takes place at 11:30. They're really intending to teach very different things, but the questions that we put on the assessment will feature both, so we do actually have to have you at both of them. Okay, so I would point out that this week is not the end of bioinformatics either. For those of you who take the next generation sequencing module, is that most of you, all of you? It's not a mandatory elective, is it? Okay. So for those who take next generation sequencing, you're going to get 3 more lectures on bioinformatics, on gene expression, on assembly and annotation, and on amplicon informatics. If you take the proteomics elective, you'll have another 2 lectures from me on protein identification and protein quantitation. And if you take the special topic in clinical biomarkers, you'll get to see rather more of me. So all told, I'm around for 17 lectures this year, and it's a lot of fun. So I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I do. All right, so let us go ahead to pull open the slides. You should have received an email by now, a link to today's slides. Well, it's a link to a directory, and that directory is going to have the PDFs of all of the slides, and it's also going to have the notes that the scripts that we need for R. Please, 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 if you're taking part in the afternoon, in the 11:30 tutorial on R, please go ahead to install R or RStudio on your laptop. It will make a big difference. If you do not have access to a laptop, please beg, borrow, or steal one, and we'll try to get you up to speed with whatever we can, okay? Great. All right, so without further ado, I would go ahead with this, except one more thing. These lectures will be appearing as soon as I can get them compressed and on the network. If you want to find the channel for me on YouTube, just go to youtube.com/c/DavidTab with a capital D and a capital T. That's me. Okay, so let us proceed ahead with computer science terms that show up in bioinformatics. This is going to be a kind of an odd setup lecture because a lot of these concepts just appear all over the place, and I tried to put them at the start so that when they appear later, we can make reference back to this. We're going to start with a discussion of metadata. Metadata. How do you get the context for interpreting a biomedical experiment. We're going to talk about a rather hugely important problem. How do you represent different kinds of data points using ones and zeros? We all talk about computers being ones and zeros and make all sorts of weird generalizations about them in science fiction shows. But in fact, how we represent numbers, how we represent letters, how we represent video, all of these things are very challenging problems, and I'm going to try to talk about some of the solutions we put together for that. Compression. Compression shows up all over the place. Who hasn't received a zip file in email at this point? Well, we're going to talk about how some of the basics of compression operate, because much of the data we're producing in biology today are so large that we have to make use of it. And finally, we'll talk just very briefly about scaling and efficiency, because these are pretty important issues for what constitutes a workable solution versus a theoretical solution to a problem. Okay, so let us start then with metadata. Metadata. So meta here means rising one level above, basically. So in this case, we're creating data about data. So if you were simply given the raw data of an experiment and given no information about how it was collected, what the methods were, you would find that understanding what that result is worth would be very difficult. Imagine if you were to read a journal article that had no materials and methods section. Would you be able to evaluate any of the claims that person had made in the paper? Right. So metadata are really critical in that way. They play this kind of address of, well, which data file represents which part of the experimental hierarchy and so on. We'll talk about a concrete example of that in a minute. Okay, so they are essential for replication of the experiment. We don't always think about this replication problem, but maybe we need to think about it more, because there are a lot of people who worry that many of the experiments we publish today are one-offs, that it worked that time, but if you were to attempt to replicate that person's steps one by one, you wouldn't get the same result. So one of the ways out of this replication crisis is to improve the quality of the metadata we provide. Now this is kind of this is not something that everyone's pulling in the same direction on. You'll note that some very high-profile journals now make materials and methods in like 4-point font and at the very back of the article, and maybe most of it you have to go to the supporting information to get any actual details. So there's a lot of push now towards putting the business end of the science up front in the full-size print, and relegating the details of how it was done to a secondary status. That's a very dangerous thing for science to do. We need to be able to produce reproducible science in as great an extent as possible. If you do not have metadata for the experiment, you run a very high chance of wasting effort, of having done an experiment that can't be described sufficiently and thus can't be used. So the most concrete way to think about this for a graduate student is the lab notebook. Has somebody said lab notebook to you so far? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Remembering what you did, at what time, to produce what result matters. These are metadata. I had the awful experience last week of engaging with some R code that I had written back in November. Now November was how many months ago now? 3? Yeah. I couldn't remember what I was thinking when I wrote that code. And I didn't leave myself a lot of comments. And so my ability to understand what I was thinking, what this particular variable name was supposed to amount to, was very minimal. I've been thinking about a lot of things since November. I went on honeymoon. I had some things going on then, you know? So having metadata matters. It is the way that we prevent ourselves from wasting effort. Now, I want you to imagine that you are a new graduate student in a laboratory. This is coming soon, right? You're moving to do projects here very quickly. Have you already met your project advisors? No. Ah, okay. Have you seen some descriptions of possible projects? Yes. Yeah, all right, so this is coming soon to you. Imagine that this project says, a postdoc working for my lab was with me for 3 years and produced this really cool data set, and now we need a graduate student to come in and write it up for him or her. That's not that implausible an ask. But what happens if when you look at the directory where that postdoc stored his or her results, you have DT vial 85, vial 23, vial 59, 5, 93, and 26. You just have those 6 files. You have a problem now. So if you have to go digging through a lab notebook in order to figure out what these files represent, to understand that these 3 are part of a TNF alpha treated cohort and these 3 are part of a control cohort, you're going to have a problem. So storing our metadata as clearly as possible is very important to people being able to continue our work when someone else comes in to pick up where we left off. Now, you are surrounded by metadata whether or not you know it. How many people have snapped one selfie today? At least one selfie. No one? No one snapped any selfies?
Too early.
Too early? All right, we got to wait for our full flush comes together. I agree, 9 o'clock is a little early, but I have to say, my contract says I have to show up by 7:30 a.m. every morning. So some campuses start earlier than this. I once showed up to do a grand rounds lecture at a medical school, and the lecture was slated at 7:30 in the morning. That was rough. I wasn't ready for that. That's all right. Okay, so let's talk about one of the most common examples of metadata, and that is EXIF, E-X-I-F. This photo was actually taken from this very building, off of one of the upper story balconies. And this is the Tigerberg School. Here's the Fison building where I work. This is my great photo. But when I took the picture, the camera was not just storing image, it was also storing metadata. So if I go sniffing through the metadata that were stored for this image, I see at the top that it has a file name, image 8890CR2, which means it was the 8,890th photo taken on that camera. Kind of a shutter button. It says that the camera model is a Canon EOS M2. That's now my old camera. It was on firmware version 1.02. It was shot at March 30th, 2017 at 11:44 a.m. We're trying to be a little personal, aren't we? All right. Shooting mode, TV speed, metering ISO, etc. All of this information. And did I tell it to record any of that information? I did not. Now, I don't have a GPS module on this camera, and I'm really grateful for that, because if it were to stamp the location of every photo on there, I would start feeling a little sensitive about posting some of these things. You do, however, have a GPS-enabled camera in your pocket right now, by all odds. Most cameras have location services that allow them to figure out where in the world they are, and when you snap a photo with location services turned on, that information is written as part of the JPEG file. If you were to suddenly share that on, do we use Instagram this week? Instagram. If I share that image on Instagram, that information is not stripped away from it. It stays with that JPEG file. And now, anyone who sees that image on JPEG can say, this person was at this location at this time. And if you happen to have shot a whole bunch of photos in your home address, not your home address, but your home GPS coordinates are written on all of the photos you've taken there. Metadata has real impact for privacy as well. So be quite aware of that one. Now, metadata have been increasingly shoved for among the people who are collecting repositories of data. Metadata help us to, after all, understand what these data mean. So when we look at something like Miami, we're looking at minimal information standards. This is minimal information about a microarray experiment, actually. Miami was one of the first minimal information standards that were published. But this is hardly the only field where people have said, this is the minimum amount you have to tell me if you're going to store these data here. Miami, I work in a field called MIAPI, minimal information about proteomics experiments. We actually have a whole bunch of people getting together here in Cape Town next month to talk about minimal information standards for the field of proteomics. So this is a push that spreads over all of the biotechnologies. Being able to publish your information to the world requires that you're able to tell that story in enough detail that people can understand your experiment well enough that it could be reproduced. Minimal information standards are one of the ways that journals are getting more careful about what details must be included before your science gets published. You would not be the first person to try to publish a proteomics experiment only to be told, I'm sorry, you've not provided all of the information needed. Since about 5-10 years ago now, a journal called Molecular and Cellular Proteomics put together this big push saying, if you don't have this set of information for your, in each paper you try to publish, we won't even send it out for peer review. They have an admin sitting in the offices of this journal saying, okay, did they introduce this point? Did they answer that question? Did they answer that question? Did they answer that question? Okay, this one can go for review. But if you fail that test, the manuscript comes right back to you saying, you haven't included enough metadata for us to publish this. So, lab notebooks matter. Transmitting that information through the manuscript also matters. All right. Do we have any quick questions about metadata? Moving to a country that drinks tea every morning is the best thing I ever did. Okay. So what about all those ones and zeros? How can we express numbers, letters, and visual information through patterns of ones and zeros? It's not inherently obvious, is it? So I'm going to talk about some of the simplest concepts behind this. And it's going to boil down to powers of 2. So generally speaking, if you count, you're going to start with 1 and go to 2 and go to 3 and go to 4. But with computers, when we look at what each bit means, we're going to instead rise with powers of 2. So when I say 2 to the 0th, 2 to the 0th power, what number am I talking about? 1. Any number raised to the 0th power is always 1. Great. So our rightmost column here is going to be equal to 1. The next column over is 2 to the 1st, and it has a value of 2. Any number raised to the 1st power is itself. Great. What about 2 raised to the 2nd power? 4. Okay, next number?
8.
Yeah, you're just reading off the column letters. That's okay. That's okay. Taking a shortcut. That's fine. Okay, so in the same way that when you look at a decimal number, if you see the number 53, it's not the same number as 35, is it? Right? Because in the case of 35, 3 is multiplied by 10. In the case of 53, the 5 gets multiplied by 10 before you figure out what its weight is, so to speak. In the same way, being further to the left in a binary string like this is going to increase its weight by 2-fold at each step. So we frequently talk about bytes. A byte is just 8 bits in this case. So its maximum value is shown by this very top row. We can add a 1 to a 2 to a 4 to an 8 to a 16 to a 32 to a 64 to 128, and that gives us a sum of 255, exactly. So 255 is the largest value that we can express with 8 bits in this way. All 8 bits are turned on, that comes to a value of 255. If we were instead to do this, kind of work our way up from 1, you can see that having only the rightmost bit turned on gives us a value of 1. Having the next to last turned on gives us a 2. Having these last 2 values switch to 1 gives us a value of 3. This is a part where a lot of people sort of hit a wall and they don't get it the first time, so I'm going to try that again. This value, we are adding together a 1 in the final position, which has a weight of 1, and a 1 in the next to last position, which has a value of 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. Ah! Okay, so this is kind of sneaky. What I've shown you is what all the binary numbers from 1 to 8 look like. 1, 10, 11, 100, 101, 110, 111, 1000 is the binary way of saying 1 through 8. Okay. Now, I would relate that back when I learned to program back in the 1980s, we didn't have a lot of really great languages to help us to draw things. So whenever I wanted to create a high-resolution graphic, I would sit down with a little piece of graph paper that was 8 lines, 8 rows tall, and 8 columns wide, and then I would just draw X's in all of the boxes that I wanted to be filled with a dot, and leave blank all the ones that didn't have something I wanted filled in. And then I would do these sums across each row to figure out what values I needed to poke into memory to create an image that looked like that. Things have gotten a lot better on the programming side, I have to say. But for me, looking at 101 and saying that's 5 is probably going to be a little easier than someone who's learning it for the first time. I appreciate that. But what I would like you to remember then is that as a 1 is in each column further to the left, its weight increases by 2-fold for each column move. Okay, now that gives us the ability, in this case an unsigned byte, to represent numbers from 0 to 255. What would 0 look like in binary? Zeros all the way across the board, exactly. If I had 8 zeros instead of 8 ones, the value would be 0. So in this unsigned way, I can represent any number from 0 to 255 using just this string of 8 binary digits. That's great. Now, we frequently want to represent numbers that are more complex than this. And so I'm going to try to walk us through the example of a car. Does anyone know what a car number is? It's a character. It's a character. And we have a special way to represent those. We're going to get to it in a couple slides, but not quite yet. Okay, so when we represent a character in just in ordinary English or European text, this won't work for all. You can't do like Chinese Mandarin in 8-bit like this, but if you're doing like a Western European language, you can generally represent each character with 1 byte. So 8 bits are used to represent each character. Now, we typically, when we use variables, we want to be able to represent numbers larger than 255. I mean, how often is it that you work with a spreadsheet where no value goes higher than 255? Right, we need some flexibility. So one of the things that we do is to package 2 bytes together. So 2 bytes gives us 16 different positions for each value. And when we represent an integer, we frequently use just that amount of space. Now there's another thing going on that I'm not talking about here called 2's complement that allows us to represent both positive and negative numbers in the space of 8 bits, in the space of 16 bits, however many bits. It has a little bit of overhead, but it's something that we can do. Sometimes, however, we need to be ready to use very large numbers. What if you were writing software to find large prime numbers, right? You probably wouldn't want to stop with just 2 bytes. And so we have long integer formats that use 4 bytes for each representation. How many bits is that? 32. Right, so 32 bits would be what we use for this. Does anyone remember that process a couple years back when we all switched over from using something like Windows XP that was always like 32-bit and switched out for stuff like Windows 7 and Windows 8 in 64-bit mode? Yeah, that was all about this. It was all about having the ability to store memory addresses in 64 bits rather than 32. The reason was people were getting lots and lots of RAM in their computers, so they needed more space to store the addresses. So that's where that came from. Now, floating point is pretty wild stuff. So here I've written that we need 1 plus 8 plus 23 bits. All kind of weird, right? So in this case, the 23 bits are used to represent the 2.66256 whatever, the long part. And then we then we say e to some power associated with it, and then we have the sign of the number. So the 32 bits get chopped up into these different roles to represent different parts of a floating point number. Does everyone recall what I mean when I say the answer is 1.6E3? 1.6E3. Somebody want to translate that to English for me? 1.6E3.
Isn't it, yeah,
10 to the
exponent.
when it's an exponent.
Yes, yes. Okay, what does that mean? 1.6E3, what would you say normally?
Times 10 to the power.
Is it 1.6 times 10 to the power 3?
Yes, which is?
Wait,
Okay, all right. 10 to the power of 3 is what? I hear 1,000? Someone said
Yeah,
1,000?
yeah.
1,000.
Okay, so 1.6E3 could also be said as
1,600 and something.
1,600.
Oh.
Very nice. Okay, so in this case, the 1.6 whatever would be stored in these 23 bits. The 3 would be stored in these 8 bits, and this would remain positive, right? So we have this kind of complex way to store this information that has to get mapped to bits in a way. We can also use even larger number of bits to store numbers with even greater precision. What about the number pi, right? I mean, do all we care about it on pi is 3.14? No, there's more stuff there, right? Now, back when I was in high school, I was one of those. Yes, I was trying to memorize more digits of pi than my best friend could. That was rough. I grew out of that phase, but I still know 20 digits of pi for some strange reason. So for something like that, having a double float can be valuable, where you can store more and more of these digits after the decimal. Okay, so I hope what you've gotten out of this slide is that these bits can be used to represent numbers, and the number of bits that you use to hold that, to store that value, can increase the precision with which you represent it. All right, on we go. Now, we've talked a little bit about binary versus decimal. Remember we said 1, 10, 11, 100, 101, 110, 111, 1000 are the first few numbers in binary. Over here at the right, we're looking at an altogether different way of structuring this. In the case of decimal numbers, each digit can be one of 10 values, 0 through 9, right? Everyone sees that. In the case of binary, each digit can be one of 2 numbers, 0 or 1. Correspondingly, we need more digits to be able to express the same numbers. But when we get to hexadecimal, now each value can take on any of 16 values. All right, so when we look at these first 10 rows, we see that we have 0, 9 for hexadecimal lining up with 9 for decimal, right? But where decimal next has to go to 2 digits, 2 places to store the number, from 9 to 10, 9 to 10, here we go from 9 to A, and A to B, and A to C. It keeps going with 16 different glyphs for each character, all the way up to OF, which represents 15. And then finally, we have to make use of that second digit to make 10 in hexadecimal the same thing as 16 in decimal. So from time to time, binary is going to show up and make your life a little bit more complex. And sometimes, as a shorthand, rather than pulling out these really huge series of zeros and ones, people are going to show it in hexadecimal instead because it's more compact. How it is. Oh, there was a question.
Why does it, like when it gets to 16, why do you stop suddenly with the letters? Because you have enough letters anyway.
Remember that we frequently use bytes to represent binary strings. In this case, we see that in binary, sorry. I think you're asking a different question than I'm answering. So let me start with what you're asking. Why would you start with A rather than going to 10?
No, I understand.
Oh, okay, because we're using
fine.
16 different symbols for each character.
I get that, but I'm saying why do you stop by F and then suddenly go back to 10?
Ah, okay. Well, hexadecimal was not created to make a creative use of the alphabet. Hexadecimal was created as a shorthand for describing binary. Okay, so let me try to explain that. In binary, if you have 8 bits, what's the largest number you can report?
255.
255, right. Okay, so the largest number in hexadecimal with 2 places is FF. And FF has the same value as, has the same value as all ones across a byte, and has the same value as 255 over here. So the largest 2-digit hexadecimal number is the same as the largest 8-bit binary number. This is a shorthand for describing binary numbers. So that's why they went with 16 different characters. I mostly want you to be aware of it. I'm not going to expect you to count in hexadecimal on the quiz. But I want you to be able to think about the fact that you may have different numbers of symbols that you can use between binary and octal. We didn't talk about octal, but that's a number system where you use 0 through 7. Binary, where you have just zeros and ones, and hexadecimal, where you have 0 through F, which is 16 different places. All right, so all of these number systems get used in programming. Oh, there was another question, I just heard it. Okay, well, I'm sure you all remember from high school when you talked about base and numbering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that just bringing back horror stories from high school? Sometimes that stuff shows back up, and in programming, it's one of those places where it does. All right, now, I mentioned a moment ago that we were going to have to talk about how we represent characters with bits as well. How many characters did I say are required for an ordinary character? 1 byte or 8 bits, in other words. So we have 256 possible combinations here. I'm only showing 128 here. ASCII is the most common way that we map map numbers to letters. So we see that the capital A is in the 4th column in row 1. So 65 decimal is used to represent capital A in ASCII. If I wanted a small a, though, I would have to use the 6th column first row instead. So that would be adding 32 to that. Okay, so we have the ability to, because people have just sat down to say, look, we're all going to agree this is how it works. 32 is a space, 65 is capital A, 64 is the @ symbol, for example. So a long time ago, people just put together this system, and it's been in place since the 1960s. Do you happen to know when ASCII was created? Long time back. At the time, there were lots of different people doing this. So if you were working in the IBM world, you were using something called EBCDIC instead of ASCII. But over time, ASCII has kind of won out as the standard way to represent letters with these different number values. Now, I wanted to mention a couple special characters that frequently show up here. It's going to show up in the coding later, and I just didn't want you to be caught out with them. The first of these is \t. \t. Frequently, we want to create columns of output in our across a single line, and for that, a tab stop is really useful. So if you need to separate values in a line of text you're outputting, you would frequently use a \t, a tab. That is number 9 in ASCII. We frequently use \n as well. \n represents go to the start of the next line. In this case, I've pointed to 2 different rows, and this relates to a discrepancy between the Windows world and the Unix world. For a long time in the Windows world, you would always write what's called a carriage return with a line feed, whereas in the Linux world they would leave out the line feed. This relates to old school line printers. Has anyone seen these things? You used to see these things in data centers, but no one hangs on to them at this point. A line printer was one of these devices with a little head moving back and forth, knocking pins into an ink ribbon to write on the surface of the paper. And a carriage return would cause the print head to move back to the start of the line, but a carriage return line feed would cause the print head to return to the start of the line and to move the roll of paper up one. You would not think that this thing, that something as old as that was still affecting how programming happens today, but in fact it is. So the carriage return and starting on the beginning of the next line, we always just represent as \n, but in effect it represents 2 characters. Okay, so I'm going into a lot of extra little stories here, but the short version is that we needed a standard way for individual numbers to map to letters, and ASCII serves that purpose pretty well. Now, I mentioned the problem of dealing with Mandarin and Japanese characters and stuff like that. those require much more than a single byte to represent each symbol, because how many different symbols do you have in Mandarin compared to English? A lot more, a lot more. So typically, when we write East Asian languages in particular, we use something called Unicode, which is a much more complex system than this to try to explain, and I'm not going to get to it. You may have remembered my saying that I'm showing 128 different values in this table at the left. But remember, we've got a whole byte to store these characters in, so what's on the other half of this table? And the answer is all those crazy little accented characters that we use, right? You might have an O with an umlaut over it. That's in the other half of this. An N with a tilde over it. That's on the other one. A C with a cedille hanging below it. That's on the other half of the byte. So this standard way of representing characters with numbers, ASCII, is just incredibly widespread, very worth knowing about. Okay. We've talked about how to represent different kinds of numbers in bits. We've talked about how to represent different letters in bits. Now we're going to talk about how to represent visual information in bits. Okay, so how many megapixels is the camera in your phone?
24.
Somebody say 24? A 24 megapixel phone
Yes.
camera.
Yes.
Is that an expensive phone?
No.
Oh, all right, all right. All right, so
Samsung.
they make good phones. All right, so if you have a 24 megapixel camera in your phone, what does that mean? What's a megapixel? What's 1 pixel?
I don't know how to explain this. How do you explain this?
A bitmap is a grid of points, each represented by a particular combination of colors. And that position within the bitmap is a pixel. All right? So when you say 24 megapixel, it means that the sensor on your phone is storing 24 million dots, the color intensities for 24 million dots for each photograph you take. Yeah. When I capture one on my my Canon mirrorless, it's storing 18 million pixels, and it takes about 25 megabytes per image for each image if you store it in raw format. Now this is going to lead to our discussion about compression, right? When you have as much data as that being captured by the device, storing it all in the raw is bulky, really bulky. And most of us don't have huge amounts of storage on our phones. Huge related to 3 years ago, yes, but our ability to generate data is always challenging our ability to store it. So compression is going to be a big deal. So each pixel represents a particular location within this image. Sometimes we're talking about three-dimensional image volumes instead, where you have not just X and Y, but also a Z plane. And for something like that, we would use the term voxel instead. But a pixel is all we really need to care about at the moment. So I have some grid of light intensities, and I have pixels representing some particular spot within it. Let's start with the concept of gray, right? Gray could be anything from pitch black all the way to clear white in this case. And if you're storing one byte of color of light intensity for each location in this image, how many different shades of gray can you represent for just that 1 pixel? If you're storing 1 byte to represent light intensity for this point in the pixel, how many different shades of gray can you represent?
8.
8 is the number of bits, but somebody over here said it. 255. Just as there are 255 different numbers that you can represent with 8 bits, you can store 255 shades of gray with 1 byte per pixel. All right, now the complexity is really going to get out of hand when we talk about this next point. What about color? What about color? Most typically, the images you're capturing on your phone are using a 24-bit color model. Now, when I say 24, you immediately notice it's divisible by 8, right? Everyone got that right off. I said 24 bits, and you said, oh, that's 3 bytes. So those 3 bytes mean that we're storing light intensity for 3 different colors: red, green, and blue. So each pixel is not just represented by 1 byte. Each pixel is represented by 3 bytes. One saying how red is it, one saying how green is it, and one saying how blue is it. Okay, so 24 bits being stored for each of 20 million pixels is a lot of information. A lot of information. Now, let's talk a little bit about this decision to use 8 bits per pixel. I'll lay down my tea because I'm making rattly noises with it. All right. If you had 1 bit to be stored at each position, each pixel within this image, you could store, if it's white, write a 0, and if it's black, write a 1. Okay, that's just 1 bit. The pictures that come out are not that informative, right? It's white or it's black, it's white or it's black. This is what you get. Now this image is going to require a very small amount of data in memory, because it's just 1 bit for each pixel. Even if you've got 20 million pixels, you've got 20 million bits, divide that by 8 to get to bytes. Not too bad. If you double the number of pixels available for storing brightness levels, instead of having white and black, we now have white, light gray, dark gray, and black. We went from having 2 possibilities to 4 possibilities. Does that remind anyone of when we were talking about binary digits? Right, just 2 different values are possible with 1 bit, but 4 different values are possible when you have 2 bits. When you slide up to 3 bits, now you have 8 different levels of intensity. We have just a very few bits of white in here, just a few very few small bits of black in there, but we have a variety of shades of gray in between. We have 6 different shades of gray now, just by going to 3 bits over 2. With 4 bits, we have 16 different brightness levels, 5 bits, 32 different brightness levels, and 6 bits, we're up to 64. That's not much worse than most of the photos you see, right? But you can see that all we've changed is the bit depth. We're adding more veracity to our ability to store light intensity by adding bits. Okay, which brings us to the biggie, compression. How is it that we're going to store all this information without running out of space? So, biological data are very big. Does anyone work with next generation sequencing? Is anyone anticipating that they'll be working with next generation sequencing? A few people. The data produced by an individual run of a sequencer is going to be well in excess of 1 gigabyte per experiment. So that's big. We need to think about being able to use compression to keep that information as compact as possible. Compression seeks the smallest number of bits or bytes to represent the original content. And we're going to talk about places where we're going to violate that rule. If I want to be able to reproduce the content exactly as it was, then I need to be using a kind of compression appropriate to that. I can't use something like JPEGs, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Lots of file formats that are out there, even though they don't say .zip on the end, are still using compression internally. So this is a common feature for how data gets stored. You should, at some point in your career, see almost all of these extensions on files. Zip dates back to a really old format now called pkzip that has been around for forever. It's become so commonplace that they finally just built it into Windows that you can create and extract zip files without installing even one piece of software. What about GZ? Has anyone seen that? Okay, if you work with Linux computers at all, you'll probably run into GZ files as well. This is gzip. And its somewhat more advanced cousin, blockzip2, is also out there. RAR is fun to say, but I don't see a lot of people using it these days. So we can just say it to ourselves, RAR. I used to be a big proponent of ARG, but it's okay. I mean, generally speaking, when you see zip file, when you see compressed files, you're going to recognize them as .zips and .gzs. Now, I've left out one of the most commonly used types of compressed files, the JPEG, or the QuickTime movie, or the AVI file. These things are compressed to heck and gone. It's amazing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You will also sometimes see files called .tar, and you might think that those are compressed, but actually it's a way of glomming a whole bunch of tiny files into one big file. It's very frequently used in combination with GZ, so .tar, .gz is something one often sees. Okay, so let's talk about one of the easiest strategies to do compression, run length encoding. Run length encoding. So I want you to imagine that I have a series of bytes, each one represented by a single box up here. And in this case, A might represent, let's say, black, and B might represent gray, and C might represent white. Okay? So we have a whole series of A's, followed by a shorter series of B's, followed by an even shorter series of C's. So run length encoding is a strategy to recognize that we have many, many copies of A all coming one after each other. So if we count them, we can say that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 A's. And so in a run length encoding string, we can report that as A repeated 8 times. What follows it is B, 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 B. That's 6 B's. So B repeated 6 times. And finally, C repeated twice. So before, we needed to have 16 bytes in a row. Remember? So we had 8 A's, 6 B's, 2 C's. That's a total of 16 bytes in a row. But after we did run length encoding, we only had to store 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bytes in a row. So you can see that for some kinds of images, using run length encoding is going to dramatically squeeze how many bytes we need to use to represent the picture. Does everyone see that? Okay. I'm going to ask you another question though. If you have this string and you know the rule that it was used to create it, can you approximately recreate the original, or can you perfectly recreate the original? Perfectly. Okay, so this is an example of lossless compression. This is like formal compression, the most typical way that we would store things. We're going to talk about one that's a whole lot more complex, though. It was probably, for me, one of the biggest aha moments when I was in a computer science data structures course. But I understand that it can blow people's minds, too, so we'll try to be careful as we go. I was happy to find a blog post for oxforddictionaries.com that said, which letters are used most in English language? Okay, so how many of us have ever watched Wheel of Fortune? They never played Wheel of Fortune here. I'm so disappointed. Did you guys play Hangman on a little piece of paper? Okay, right.
Yeah.
So, who here starts with Q on Hangman? Nobody starts with Q. Why don't you start with Q?
Start with the vowels.
Q is really rare. Yeah, and you only have so many letters you can name that aren't in the phrase before, you lose, right? So Q is the least used letter in the English language. But along with it, we've got things like J and Z and X, so on. Now, once you get to V, it's a little more popular, right? My first name has a V in it. There you go. But if we slide all the way to the other end, here we get to E being really common. A, R, I, O. We see those vowels showing up really heavily, right? So if we're just counting consonants, we've got R and T and N and S and L and C as being the really popular ones. Okay. When did I stop talking about compression? I am talking about compression. If we were to use 1 byte to represent each letter, it would be, we'd be wasting some space. Because not all of these letters are used with the same frequency. It would be nice if we could use fewer bits for the most common letters and more bits to represent the least common letters. Sneaky, huh? All right, so before we were talking about ASCII, where 8 bits is always going to be used for each letter in the alphabet. Now, we're using something subtler that says the more frequently a letter is used, the fewer bits I choose to use to represent it. Okay, ready for the mind blow? Here it comes. Boom! Whoa. Okay. Huffman codes are a way of figuring out how many bits you need to use for each symbol in that letter, in that alphabet. In this case, I'm going to drop back for just a minute. We're going to say J and Q are both very rarely used. So I can join those together to form one letter called JQ. And we'll figure out how to do that. And I can keep doing this combination of symbols until I get all of the letters accounted for. So remember, we had J and Q were the least commonly used letters in the English language. Here we've merged them to be a single symbol. X and Z are also very rarely used. Those get their own symbol. These two together are still quite rarely used. We can join those together. Okay, so what we've done is to create a relatively short path to letters like E and a relatively long path to letters like J, Q, X, and Z. This is where I really need my pointer. All right, well, I'm not very tall. So I want you to imagine tree traversal. We're going to start at the top of this tree, and we're going to ask how many bits we need to get to a particular letter. So starting at the alphabet, up at the very top of the tree, how many decisions do we need to make to get to E?
2.
I hear 2.
3.
I hear 3.
Yeah.
In this case, 3 is correct. We need to say we're in the set of letters at the left, we're in the EHMS to the right, and then we need to get left again. So you can represent the path to E. I'm going to just arbitrarily call left 0 and right 1. Excuse me. Okay, so I need a 0, I need a 1, I need a 0. So with those 3 bits, I can represent E. How many bits do I need to signal that the next letter is a Q? Q's down here. Left, 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 right, 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 left, right. What was the count?
8.
8. So in this case, with a Huffman code derived from usage patterns of the alphabet, I can get to E with just 3 bits and 8 for getting to Q. So if I'm telling a story, so long as I provide someone with my Huffman code that specifies which bit patterns correspond to which letter, I can just give them a very long string of 0s and 1s. They run it through this tree, and every time they hit a green blob, they say, okay, that's the letter that this string means. The next bit starts at the top again. Everyone see that? Okay, so now English text should require far fewer bits to store than what ASCII would have required. Now, what's missing from this tree? Special characters, right. So I might be missing a period, or a space, or an exclamation mark, or an apostrophe. Lots of things. What about numbers? Yeah, so we're missing some pretty key things on that score. But if you're able to switch between these, to maybe add in an extra thing that's a special character that then gets spelled out by ASCII code or something, you could do stuff like that. But here we see a way that we could perfectly compress English text, if we had spaces and all that stuff, to a series of bits. That is the Huffman code. It is an approach that works really well when you have an uneven usage of symbols, in this case, letters. Okay, now let's come to lossy compression. We've talked about run length encoding, we've talked about Huffman codes. These are approaches that let us use, that let us perfectly capture the original. When we get to lossy compression, we're now allowing for some amount of loss of fidelity, that we can't perfectly reproduce the file that we started with before we compressed it. But this format gets very, very widely used, or this strategy gets very widely used. So I assume people still see MP3 files from time to time? All right, MP3 files have been compressed, yay howdy, a lot. All right, JPEG. People certainly have worked with JPEGs, right? You
Yes.
take them with each selfie, right? JPEG represents a lossy compression. QuickTime movies or old Windows AVI formats. These are all lossy formats. In almost every case, people who are storing media allow for some amount of degradation of the original by using these formats. So we start with an observation about our eyes. Our eyes are pretty good at recognizing luminance alterations. This is brightness alterations. When we have brightness alterations, we need to be very sensitive to that, because remember, back when we were forest dwellers and predators were after us and so on, seeing a pattern of brightness in the distance at twilight was a matter of some concern to whether you were going to survive or not, right? So our eyes have developed a lot of sensitivity to patterns of brightness. But a slight fudginess in color, we're much less sensitive to that due to the way that our eyes are constructed. So fudging the color of dots just a little bit, you can get away with a lot of when you're compressing visual information. Each save to a JPEG reapproximates the picture that you're saving. So if you scan something and save it, that very first time you save it, you're losing a lot of picture quality because you're saving it to JPEG format. If you then reload that JPEG and rewrite that JPEG, you're going to see even more diminution of the picture's quality. The strategy is to split the picture up into 8x8 blocks of pixels, and each of those gets compressed by this DCT method. However, DCT has some kind of nasty artifacts that come from it. One is blocking, another is called ringing, and one is called mosquitoes. But basically, if you look at this image at the left, you can see that this one represents a pretty early generation save of this image. But by the time you've gone through the open and resave cycle many, many times, we see that we get this weird blockiness artifact along here. Here you can make out individual eyelashes. Here you have no possibility of that. This ringing and mosquitoes thing happens when you have a bright area next to a dark area in a JPEG image, and you end up with that boundary kind of becoming really blocky and messed up. So using lossy compression does diminish the image quality. If you were to save each camera photo as in a RAW format rather than JPEG, you won't have lost that image quality from the word go. So I thought I would try to do this experiment properly. I started with a TIFF. This is an original uncompressed image. I'd taken a photograph of a sign at a place in Ghana. I just like the word change. Then I thought, okay, I'm now going to just save it as a JPEG. And we can see that there's already been some dissolution. If I look at the N in the word change, I see a pretty solid band on the end slash. Before, when it's a TIFF, and the first time I save it as a JPEG, I suddenly have this kind of mottled appearance to it. And by the time I've gone through 7 different saves, well, it's all just kind of become this muddled mess. So, resaving JPEGs will come at a cost. Being able to work with data as close to its original capture as possible helps you evade that. This is an outcome of lossy compression. How am I doing on time? Oh, I've been going almost an hour. Good, because we're about to finish up. All right. There is so much one might say about scalability and efficiency in computer science. So much. I took a whole year of classes just on this topic when I was an undergraduate. I love this topic. I'm giving myself one slide today. One of the things that we could think about is the cocktail party handshake problem. Have people heard of this one?
No.
If you have n people attending a party, how many distinct handshakes can you have?
To the above n.
Not quite, but that's a good start, I would say. Let's think our way through the problem. First off, can I shake my own hand? No, we're ruling that out. Shaking your own hand is pointless. It's very silly. Next, if I shake your hand, have you also shaken my hand?
Yes.
Ah, okay, great. So if A shakes B, B shakes A as well. So is that commutative? Am I remembering that correctly? A commutative property. Okay, great. So the number of handshakes I personally can participate in is equal to the number of people at the party minus 1. Minus 1. Because I can't shake my own hand. Okay. So the way, and we're going to have to do a little bit of accounting for this fact that if A shakes B, B also shakes A. All right. So the number of handshakes you can have at a party is equal to n, the number of people at the party, multiplied by n minus 1, divided by 2. So I'm going to ask people to do some math here. I have 5 people attending a party. This is my size of party, right? I'm old, we don't do big parties. Okay, so I have 5 people at my party. How many different handshakes can we have? 10. Who did that? That was fast. All right. Yes, so 5 times 4 is 20, divided by 2 is 10. Now, if we have just one more person at our party, how many handshakes are there? If there are 6 people at a party, how many handshakes can you have?
15.
15.
Sure.
Exactly. So here we see something that's scaling more quickly than the linear size, right? We had 5 people at the party, we had 10 handshakes. We had 6 people at the party, we have 15 handshakes. That's something that's growing with the square of the number of people. That's a big deal. So when we describe the runtime efficiency of software, we always have to be cognizant of how the time to compute the answer reflects upon the data that we're input. So when we start with log base 2 of n, we see that we would say the runtime scales with the log of the data size. So a binary search tree is something I've already shown you. We did it with the Huffman Codes. Remember, at each junction, we could either go left or right. So if you're trying to find a particular letter in a binary search tree, the time required scales with log base 2 of the size of the tree. Great. So that is a pretty good performance for a bioinformatics tool. Big O of n is something where the runtime is going to scale linearly with data size. So if you have twice as many data points, it takes twice as much time to run. That too is a pretty good performance for a bioinformatics tool. But what happens if you get to something like big O of mn? The runtime now is a multiple of 2 different data sizes. If you're trying to do an alignment of one sequence with another, that's an example of a big O of m by n problem. This is where things start bogging down, they start getting pretty slow. But if you run into something like a big O of 2 to the n, you really are in a world of hurt. The runtime scales exponentially with more and more data. So let us say that I have 2 cities. What is the shortest possible trip between those cities? Straight line, right? Okay. But if you've got 3 cities, what is the shortest possible path that traverses through all of those cities? Now you have to consider more possible outcomes. Which one you start at, which one you end at, and so on. And by the time you get to 10 cities, finding the shortest path through that passes through all 10 cities gets to be really, really hairy. So problems like this really cause bioinformatics people to just sort of tear at their hair a little bit. So ideally, when you craft an algorithm to solve a particular problem, your goal is to keep upwards on this chart and not get into something that takes exponential time to run. Someday, when you are sitting around waiting on the computer to come up with an answer from an analysis of a data set, you'll think back at this lecture saying, gosh, I wonder if this software has been written to be as efficient as could possibly be done on data problems like this. But this slide is just one reminder of the way that we characterize that performance. Okay, so systems biology employs bioinformatics for pre-processing, for follow-on summarization, established knowledge representation and visualization, all kinds of crazy stuff that's all going to require computers. No one in this room gets to escape the use of computers for analyzing their data. My wife is a historian, and right now they're studying how to evaluate the haplotypes of cattle mitochondrial DNA to figure out where they were first domesticated, right? Biology is everywhere, and all of us are going to require the help of computers to address the summarization of the data that we get. Lots of computer science fundamentals have gone into the algorithms that we use. Whether or not you ever develop your own bioinformatics tools, being able to understand a little bit of computer science to understand how these algorithms work will benefit you tremendously. Biologists must understand some computer scientists. And I've gone in the opposite direction as well. Computer scientists are frequently turning to biology in order to find interesting problems. So this is the field of bioinformatics represents the comings and goings of both of these populations of people. And I think that it makes computer scientists, their concerns more real world, and they make biologists' concerns more quantitative. This has been a good handoff for both. Okay, so if there are no questions, I will look forward to seeing you all at 11:30, where we will talk about something completely different. Look forward to it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.